An arrest has now been made in the 1981 murder of a Grapevine woman more than 4 decades after she was strangled to death. And investigators say a break in the case actually came through DNA collected from items found in the suspect's trash. And while the murder happened in Grapevine, the suspect was arrested in Colorado. Marissa Armas has that story.
On a February afternoon in 1981, a Braniff Airlines flight attendant was found strangled inside her own apartment in Grapevine, Texas, and the man responsible wasn't a stranger investigators never found. He was the very first person they interviewed, sitting inside his own living room, with a fresh wound on his thumb he couldn't quite explain. The person investigators would spend 45 years trying to identify was already sitting right in front of them. They had his name. They had spoken to him. They had noticed the unexplained injury. But he walked away that same day. And freely, for 45 years. 45 years. That's how long it took to prove what one detective suspected from the very first afternoon. And think about what 45 years actually means. People were born. People grew old. People who loved Beverly grew older without ever knowing who had taken her away. And somewhere in the middle of all that time, the man responsible was simply living his life. The man responsible had a name investigators already knew, sitting untouched inside the case file since 1981. He was questioned once, but has never been fingerprinted. In the decades that followed, he built an entire second life 1,000 miles from where it happened, married, grew old, took his trash to the curb every week like anyone else, and never once imagined that a soda bottle sitting out for garbage day would be the thing that finally caught up to him. How does a murder investigation survive for 45 years when the name you're looking for has been sitting inside the original case file the entire time? And what happens when the evidence that finally breaks the case isn't found at a crime scene at all, but in someone's trash? Stick around, because by the end of this story, you'll understand how a murderer can hide in plain sight and still never be caught. It would take a bloodstained nightgown preserved for decades, a DNA database search that came back with nothing, a case file nobody expected to matter again, and finally, a quiet stakeout outside a house 900 miles from where a woman was killed, waiting for nothing more than trash day. That's what it took to bring a 45-year-old murder back from the dead. Welcome back to Missing Hour. Let me know in the comments what city or country you're watching from. And to everyone who's already subscribed, shared an episode, or left a comment on a previous case, thank you, genuinely. This channel only reaches more people because you keep passing these stories along. Her name was Beverly Bruneau. Friends called her Casey. She was 35, a Braniff Airlines flight attendant based in Dallas-Fort Worth, the kind of job that had her flying internationally one week and back home in Texas the next. And before she became a name inside a 45-year-old murder file, she was simply Beverly, a woman with friends, a career, a home, people who loved her, plans for a future she never got to see. One of her closest friends was a fellow Braniff attendant named Thelma. The two had worked together, lived together, and years earlier had bought a house in Dallas jointly, an arrangement that outlasted their living situation once Thelma married a man named Larry Brown and moved to Grapevine. By 1981, Beverly had moved into her own Grapevine apartment with her boyfriend, also a Braniff employee. The Dallas house the two women still jointly owned had recently been damaged by fire. That's the life Beverly was living in the weeks before February 13, 1981. And nobody around her knew that she was living through the final weeks of her life. That morning, Beverly's boyfriend left for work while she was still asleep. He tried calling her later in the day and got no answer, which wasn't like her. When he got home around 3 that afternoon, the front door was closed but unlocked. Inside, he found Beverly on the living room floor, an electrical cord wrapped around her neck. The woman who had left behind an ordinary morning was suddenly gone. The apartment showed clear signs of a violent struggle. A neighbor later told police she'd heard a man calling out, asking someone to contact the police. The medical examiner determined Beverly had been strangled sometime during the mid-morning, hours before her boyfriend came home and after he'd already left for work. She had injuries consistent with fighting back, but there was no evidence of sexual assault. Investigators found blood on multiple surfaces in the apartment, including smudges near the kitchen sink that looked like they could have been left by fingers. And that blood would eventually become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. But in 1981, investigators had no way of knowing that. Her boyfriend's account checked out against his work schedule and the estimated time of death. Whoever did this had come and gone during a window when the apartment should have been empty. Detectives moved outward from the scene, toward Beverly's friends, her finances, anyone with a recent conflict. That trail led directly to Thelma Brown and to the fire-damaged house in Dallas the two women still owned together. When detectives went to speak with Thelma, she was away on an international flight. Her husband answered the door instead. Larry Brown had worked for Braniff as a pilot and flight engineer, though he'd reportedly been laid off by the time Beverly was killed. He also had an interest in a construction company, a detail that would matter later. He told detectives that on the morning of the murder, he'd been meeting contractors at the fire-damaged Dallas house between 9 and 11 that morning, then headed to his company's office, roughly the same window investigators believed Beverly had been killed in. Detectives noticed something else during that first conversation: a fresh injury under his thumbnail, the surface skin visibly torn away. He said he'd gotten it at work. One investigator on the case didn't think that explanation matched the wound. And suddenly, investigators had something they couldn't ignore. Beverly had fought her attacker. There was blood inside the apartment. And the man sitting in front of them had a fresh injury on his hand. Could those three things possibly be connected? In 1981, there was no way to know whose blood it was. But decades later, that question would become the reason this case finally moved again. Detectives wanted Larry's fingerprints to compare against the marks near the sink. They wanted a photograph of his injury. They wanted him to take a polygraph. But he said no to all three. Under the law, that was entirely his right. There was no physical evidence tying him to the apartment, and without his cooperation, there was no way to get any. Larry Brown walked out of that interview a free man, and Beverly's murder stayed unsolved. So what does an investigation do when its strongest lead simply refuses to cooperate, and there's nothing on paper that can force the issue? It follows the money instead. Beverly and Thelma had bought the Dallas house together years earlier, and even after Thelma moved out and married Larry, she remained legally tied to the mortgage. The Browns, meanwhile, had bought their own home in Grapevine, meaning Thelma was carrying two households' worth of financial obligation. Investigators were told the Browns pushed Beverly to sell the Dallas property, bring in a new roommate, or release Thelma from the mortgage entirely. Beverly refused. The original arrangement stayed exactly as it was. There was one more detail buried in that mortgage that investigators later flagged as significant: a credit life insurance policy that would pay off part of the loan if either owner died. And suddenly, this wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about money. It was about pressure. And eventually, investigators would have to ask a much darker question. What happens when someone becomes more valuable to another person after they're dead? Then, on November 3rd, 1980, while Beverly was away working a flight, the Dallas house caught fire. Firefighters extinguished it. That same night, Larry reported it burning again. The second fire was later described as suspected arson. What had been a difficult property arrangement was now an active insurance claim, and Larry inserted himself directly into it, submitting repair estimates through his construction company that, according to the arrest affidavit, ran substantially higher than what the insurer's own appraisers found. The insurance company refused to pay the amount requested. The dispute stopped being about a damaged house and became a fight over whose numbers would be submitted and whether Beverly would sign off on them. Beverly's family later told investigators she believed signing that paperwork meant participating in insurance fraud. She wouldn't do it, and because she was still a legal co-owner of the property, her signature was required either way. 3 days before she was killed, Larry went to Beverly's apartment specifically to discuss those papers. According to her mother, the conversation turned into a heated argument. Afterward, Beverly told her mother she was afraid of him. Think about that for a moment. She had already told someone she was afraid, and just 3 days later, she was dead. That February 10th visit is the last documented confrontation between Beverly and Larry Brown before her death. Here's the detail that turns a financial dispute into a motive investigators couldn't ignore. After Beverly died, her signature appeared on that insurance paperwork anyway. Investigators later alleged Thelma had added it herself, without authorization, once Beverly was no longer alive to refuse. Before Beverly died, the papers were blocked. After she died, they weren't. That sequence gave investigators a motive. It still didn't give them physical proof of who had actually been inside that apartment. The fresh wound under Larry's thumbnail and the bloody smudges by the sink sat right next to each other in the file. Two pieces that seemed like they should connect, with no way to prove they did. And then time started doing what time always does to an old case. It moved on. As the years passed, the leads that existed had already been exhausted. Witnesses moved on. Investigators retired. People who remembered Beverly began getting older. The world changed around a case that refused to change. The murder didn't go cold because anyone stopped caring. It went cold because there was nowhere left for it to go. Not with 1981's technology. But Beverly's blood-stained clothing never left evidence storage. Neither did the original interviews, the fire reports, or the notes about an injury nobody could explain. And decades later, those forgotten pieces of evidence were still waiting for something 1981 couldn't give investigators. A way to finally tell them whose blood was on Beverly's nightgown. In December 2010, nearly 30 years after Beverly's death, that clothing was finally tested using DNA technology that hadn't existed when she died. Her bloodstained nightgown was sent to a laboratory at the University of North Texas, and for the first time, investigators developed a DNA profile from an unknown man's blood found on the fabric. They ran it through CODIS, the National Criminal Database. But there was no match, and that result created another painful question. How can you finally have the evidence you've been waiting decades for, and still have no name? That didn't clear anyone, and it didn't mean the evidence was bad. It meant whoever left that blood had never been arrested for anything that would put his DNA on file anywhere. Investigators finally had a profile. They had absolutely no way to test it against the one person they'd always suspected because Larry Brown's DNA had never been collected in the first place. So the case went quiet again, this time with something almost cruel about it. The answer was sitting in a laboratory. The evidence was finally speaking, but nobody knew whose name it was saying. And for 15 more years, Beverly's family would have to wait. 15 more years with a name missing from the answer. 15 more years knowing that somewhere inside a laboratory was a DNA profile belonging to the man who had killed Beverly, but not knowing who that man was. How do you live with that? How do you close a chapter when the final page has been sitting in front of you all along, but you still can't read the last line? In 2025, a Grapevine detective went back through the entire file from the beginning. The original 1981 interviews, the fire and insurance records, the property disputes, and the 2010 DNA results that had never gone anywhere. Everything the case needed was already there. A man questioned on day one. An unexplained injury. a financial motive documented in his own words.
That's why these evidence rooms are so important to have preserved for the integrity of the data, and in some cases of the DNA, to be preserved over the course of years, because technology gets better. And 45 years ago, we had no idea that we were going to be where we are today.
And an unknown male DNA profile that had been sitting unmatched for 15 years. The case had never really lost its evidence. It had lost its opportunity. But now, someone was willing to look again. By then, Larry Brown was 79 years old, living in Loveland, Colorado. He had spent more than 4 decades living with something nobody around him knew, a secret from 1981, a murder that had followed him across state lines and through an entire lifetime. In February 2026, Grapevine police reached out to the Larimer County Sheriff's Office and asked for help obtaining what the arrest affidavit would later describe as a covert DNA sample. Deputies began watching Larry's house. They weren't looking for a confession or an interview. They were waiting for the one thing that happens at every single house in America roughly once a week: trash day. Think about how ordinary that sounds. Trash day. No dramatic confession. No chase. No detective standing at a door demanding answers. Just a garbage bin sitting outside a house in Colorado. Investigators collected items from the curb outside Larry's home: soda bottles and a discarded barbecue sauce bottle. Nothing about it looked significant to anyone driving past. But investigators weren't looking at garbage. They were looking for a chance to finally answer a question that had survived 45 years. A lab developed a DNA profile from one of the bottles and compared it directly against the unknown male blood profile that had been sitting untouched since 2010. This wasn't a database search this time. This was a direct comparison. A real name finally being tested against evidence that had waited 15 years for exactly this. The Grapevine detective got the results on May 28, 2026. Larry Brown could not be excluded as the source of the blood on Beverly's nightgown. The statistical odds of an unrelated person matching that profile were later estimated at roughly 1 in 17 billion. After 45 years, the blood finally had a name. On June 8, 2026, authorities arrested Larry Brown in Colorado on a Texas murder warrant. He was 79. He'd been 34 the year Beverly died. A Tarrant County grand jury indicted him on June 29th, alleging he killed her using either his hands or the electrical cord found around her neck. He was extradited to Texas and booked into the Tarrant County Jail. His bond was ultimately set at $100,000, and he posted it on July 21st, released under house arrest with GPS monitoring. As of the most recent reporting, the case is still pending trial. The DNA comparison that led to his arrest hasn't yet been tested in court, and everything alleged in the affidavit remains just that, an allegation, not a verdict. But for Beverly's family, something had changed. For 45 years, they had been asked to live with a question. Who did this? Who walked into Beverly's home? Who left her family without an explanation? Who got to walk away while she never got the chance to grow older? And finally, they had a name. What changed after 45 years wasn't the name detectives were considering. That name had been sitting in the file since the very first afternoon. What changed was investigators finally getting the one piece of physical evidence they'd been denied in 1981, and it came from something Larry Brown never thought twice about setting out at the curb. A bottle. Something ordinary. Something disposable. something that would have meant absolutely nothing to anyone else. But after 45 years, it became the bridge between a forgotten piece of evidence and a name. If cases like this, ones that hinge on real forensic patience rather than a lucky break, are why you're here, subscribing means you'll be here for the next one too. Because sometimes the evidence doesn't disappear. Sometimes it just waits. Beverly Bruneau's sister, Carol, was there when police finally confirmed the name behind her sister's death, more than 4 decades after she stopped expecting an answer at all. And that's the part of this story that is hardest to put into words. Carol didn't get her sister back. Nothing could do that. The arrest couldn't give Beverly another birthday. It couldn't give her another flight. It couldn't give her family another Christmas with her. It couldn't erase 45 years of wondering. But it could finally take one question away. Who was responsible? Carol has said publicly that she wants people to remember Beverly as someone full of life, someone with hopes and plans for the years she never got to live. And maybe that's the most important thing left after all these years. Because Beverly wasn't born to become a cold case. She wasn't born to become a photograph in a file. She wasn't born to become a name detectives repeated for decades. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. A flight attendant with a life that should have continued far beyond the age of 35. And then one morning, someone took that future away from her. It's been longer since she died than she lived. That's how her sister put it. Think about that, 45 years. Longer than Beverly was ever alive. Long enough for an entire generation to grow up. Long enough for investigators to retire. Long enough for technology to transform completely. Long enough for the man investigators suspected to grow old. And yet Beverly's family was still waiting for the same thing. An answer. 45 years of a name sitting in a file. And a family that never stopped waiting for someone to finally say it out loud. Now they can. And maybe that's what justice sometimes looks like in a case this old. Not getting the years back. Not undoing what happened. Just finally being able to say her name without having to follow it with the words, "We still don't know who did it." Beverly Bruneau. Her name was never forgotten. And after 45 years, neither is the name of the man accused of killing her.